Howdy guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Ben, and today I want to talk about color grading in Affinity Photo. At first I was going to talk about all the different ways that you can color grade in Affinity Photo, but after a while I just realized there's an infinite number of ways to do that, and once you start adding in blend modes and blend ranges, then that number just increases. So instead I'm going to talk about the 5 main tools that I use when I'm color grading my portraits. Okay, so before we get started, I want to make sure we have a basic understanding of how the additive or the RGB color system works, because if you don't understand how these colors interact with each other, you're going to have a really hard time getting the colors that you want and just color grading in general. Okay, so here we have a basic color wheel, and we have our primary colors, red, blue, and green, and we have our secondary colors, yellow, magenta, and cyan. The main point to remember is that secondary colors are made from an absence of the opposite primary color. So in a sense, cyan is made from an absence of red, and yellow is made from an absence of blue. Now this is really important to remember when you're color grading, because using this information, you can add colors you want, or you can take away colors you don't want. So let me show you an example. Okay, so here we have a typical kind of portrait. I chose a portrait that was a bit colorful so I could show you how these colors interact with each other. And I'm going to go ahead and just take a curves adjustment layer. I like curves because it gives you the most control, or the most kind of precise control over your colors. Okay, so let's say for example that we want to add orange into this image, that we want to just kind of give it a more orangey look. Now when we come down to our curves, we only have red, green, and blue to work with. So how are we going to create orange? Well, if we look at our color wheel, we can see that orange sits between yellow and red, or also sits between green and red. So if we want to create an orange color, we have 2 ways of doing that. We can add green and add a lot more red. So let's go ahead and try that. So I'll go into my curves adjustment. I'm going to go ahead and pick red, and I'm going to add a lot of red, and then I'm going to add just a little bit of green. And as you can see, that kind of gives me an orange color. Now if I were to add too much green, it says I get too green, so I just want to add a little bit of green to get an orange color. So there you can see that's before and that's after with a little bit of orange added. Now another way that we can do this, I'm going to add another curves adjustment layer, is because we know that orange sits between red and yellow, we can add yellow and red together. Now the way to get yellow is going to be by subtracting blue, because it's the opposite on the color wheel. So another way we could create orange is, again, I'm going to add red. So selecting the red channel, I'm going to add red, and then I am going to subtract blue to basically add yellow. And if we do that, you're going to see we now have a orange color. Now you're going to notice that this one is probably a little bit darker than our previous one. So this is our before, and this is our other one. This is where we added green and red. So we're basically adding colors, so the colors are going to become lighter. Where in this example, we were taking away blue, which means that the image is going to be a little bit darker. But we are able to create that same orange just by our general understanding of how colors work. This is going to be very important when you are doing color grading, when you want to remove tints from a certain area, when you want to add tints to a certain area. So that's just kind of a basic understanding of how we use just basically 3 colors to create any color that we want. All right, so let's talk about my favorite color grading tool that I use pretty much all the time, and that is going to be, of course, curves. So the reason why that I love the curves so much is because you have, or I feel like this tool gives you the most control over the whole tonal range of your image, right? So on the left side, we have our shadows, which we can bring up. And then on the right side, we have our highlights, which we can bring down. And then of course, in between, we can add anchor points to kind of create that classic S curve for contrast. And then we also have our red, green, and blue channel that we can isolate, so we can just add or subtract the reds in the image, or the blues or the greens or whatever we want to do. And because we talked about the way the color wheel works by subtracting things like blue, for example, you notice the image becomes yellow because we're taking blue away. So for example, let's say that I wanted to do this kind of like classic Instagram, kind of look, filter look, right? Well, let's see if we can do that here. So I'm going to go ahead and actually bring up the shadows and then bring down the highlights a little bit. And then I'm going to add a little S curve kind of in this middle, just to add a little bit of contrast. And maybe that's a bit too harsh. We'll bring it down like that. Then maybe I will come up here and grab the blue channel and drag the blue channel up. And then drag the blue channel down in the highlights to kind of create yellow. And that's going to give a kind of complementary blue and yellow effect because they're opposite on the color wheel. They look really nice when they're kind of played against each other here. If I go really extreme with it just to show you, you can see it does have a very extreme look, but that is kind of cool, right? Let me just bring that down a little bit like so and do it like that. So there we have a kind of classic like Instagram filter look where the colors are kind of desaturated. So let's kind of use this as a starting point. Now, let's say, for example, I don't like the way that the blues or the dark areas of the image that should be kind of black are becoming blue. Well, I can bring this blue channel down back here and then just add a few anchor points in here. So that way I can just add blue to the shadow area without, to add some more anchor points to anchor it down here. That way I'm adding blue to the shadows, but I'm not completely changing the darkest parts of the image. And the more extreme you go on one end, you're using it to add some more anchor points on the other end. So there we have kind of blue in the shadows. And again, if I wanted to actually have my shadows dark, then I would bring that point down here and then maybe actually bring up something like that. So, we can play around. This is not necessarily a look that I would normally do, but you get the idea, right? All right, so let's go ahead and just use this as a starting point. I'm actually going to come back. Actually, no, I'm going to reset this really quick. And let's just keep with our initial kind of like Instagram-y look, but maybe not so harsh. Something like that. So another tool that I often use a lot when color grading is going to be Selective Color. This is a great tool because with this pull down slider, you can isolate particular colors in your image and just have an effect on those colors. So for example, let's say that I want to start playing with these greens in the background. I can go ahead and select green here. And let's say that I kind of want to start pushing these greens more like an orange brown color to kind of help complement the rest of the image, like her skin and her dress. So let's see. Well, we know that if we add magenta, that's the opposite of green, right? So by adding magenta, we're going to be taking away green. And then we can also start adding red, or by taking away that cyan, which is going to now start pushing kind of red into there. And then we can also start adding lots of yellow. And as you can see there, that it kind of just turns some of those leaves a bit more brown, and that kind of unifies and ties the image together. And then of course we can play with its darkness and lightness. It doesn't really have too much of an effect depending on the colors. You can also come down here and do your whites, neutrals, and blacks. And these are kind of like your shadows, midtones, and highlights. So because those trees in the background are quite dark, I can probably further increase this effect by messing things here. That's going to basically darken things up. So one thing you have to be careful about with Selective Color is it works kind of in an additive way, where you notice that if I start taking away cyan, it just basically adds reds into these shadow areas. That's going to be the same for every color. So you have to be a little bit careful, especially when you're working with these black, neutral, and white areas of the image. But if I want to just add a little bit more of that kind of yellow color in the shadows, I can kind of play around here, find something that I think looks nice. And there we go. We've kind of like turned those green leaves into kind of more of a brown look, and that kind of matches the orange of her outfit. And then we can also do things like select the highlights, play around with that. A lot of color grading for me is just picking a tool and playing around, because I've definitely had times where I've just moved a random slider and it gave me a cool look that I wasn't really expecting. But it's also, like I said at the very beginning, it's very important to understand how these tools work, so that when you want to subtract yellow or add magenta, you know what you need to do. Now, the selective color has cyan, magenta, yellow, black, but another tool that I often use a lot is color balance. Now, usually I don't use color balance and selective color at the same time, but occasionally I do, where with color balance, it gives you tonal control over your shadows, midtones, and highlights. So if I go to my shadows here, I can add blue into my shadows, or I can add yellow into the shadows. Now, one thing you'll notice that was different about the previous selective color tool is here in the shadows, if I bring them all the way up to blue, it still preserves the darkest areas of the image, where like when I showed you with selective color, if we were to choose blacks and then I subtract yellow, so adding blue in a sense, you can see it just basically takes those blacks in dark areas and just puts some, like pumps a bunch of blue into that. So that's why you do have to be a little bit more careful with selective color, where color balance, you have a little bit more, it's a little bit more, I don't know, finesse, you know, it's not as harsh. It's not as harsh as selective color. So here I can add a bit of yellow to the shadows, and then maybe in the midtones, I'm actually going to put some blue in the midtones to kind of counteract that yellow I put in the shadows. And in the highlights, maybe I can, let's see, that's going to go red, maybe a little bit of cyan to kind of, and a little bit of blue to kind of cool down the highlights a bit. So very subtle effect, but something kind of like that. So another tool that I use quite frequently is going to be the HSL adjustment tool. Now, I'll be honest and say I mainly use this for desaturation. So let's say, for example, this blue purse, this blue handbag she has here, maybe I feel it's just a bit too, it just stands out too much. I want to kind of lower the saturation, or maybe change the color a little bit just so that it's not so popping out. So I can go ahead and click my picker here. Actually, no, before we do, let's grab a blue chip. Let's grab the picker and let's select the dress. And one thing I like to do is just completely desaturate it. Let's zoom in a little bit and move these little sliders around to try to capture as much of that handbag as I can, hopefully without affecting the rest of the image, which is going to be good because there's no other real bloops. There's no other blue in the image. Okay, and so now what I can do is I can maybe bring the saturation down, and using the hue shift slider, I can shift the hues a little bit. Maybe something like this kind of really teal color really complements that orange really well. You don't want to push it too far. If you push it too far, the colors start to get a bit kind of funky. Sometimes you can push the colors really far. For example, in an image like this, where this green shirt is just a solid green, it's pretty easy for me to take a HSL adjustment layer. Let's grab green. Let's pick this color here. Let's desaturate everything to kind of make sure we got most of that green selected without it affecting her skin. Maybe something like her out like that. Okay. And here, yeah, we have a lot of room to play, and the colors stay pretty consistent just because that green is a very solid green. You can see that the green is being reflected on her chin, so that's not changing. We'd probably fix that later. But here, yeah, we can go completely 360 degrees and get these colors looking pretty nice. After a while, they will start to break down a little bit, so you may have to finesse the tool or use masking. But for the most part, yeah, we can go from green to like a almost red, pink, and we can adjust these to lighten it up or make it more saturated. But with a handbag like this color, where there's lots of blues and purples, or even some orange being reflected, it's going to be a lot harder to make heavy adjustments to the purse without it kind of breaking down. But it's great for just tiny little shifts of hue, and maybe desaturate it and maybe try to get it a bit darker so it doesn't pop out as much. So you can see there we had a pretty big effect on the color of that handbag. And again, this is not a right or wrong, it's just, you know, a method. Okay, and the last tool that I often use during color grading, which might be surprising, is actually going to be a layer, new fill layer. So by adding a new fill layer and making sure that you have this move tool selected, let's go ahead and pick like a kind of a tan orange color. Let's go full saturation, luminosity at 50%. Now what we do now is we can change to different blend modes. So I like to sometimes use soft light, and as you can see it gives us a very, very orange look. But if we play with the opacity slider, we can drag it down and we kind of get that kind of a old look where it's almost like sepia tone, but not overly strong. We can obviously lower it a bit more if we think it's too much. And so with those 5 tools in combination, we're able to go from an image like this, which already looks great, to something like that, which has a very unique and different look. One thing that's great about the fill tool, as long as you have that move tool selected, you can still adjust those colors. So maybe let's actually do something like purple, like a kind of purple look, and it kind of gives that kind of like an old film look, where a lot of sometimes old film looked kind of purple or magenta, something like that. So again, this is really great to kind of play with an overall look, and you don't have to just use soft light. You can use other blend modes and experiment with them, and then once you start getting into playing with the blend ranges, then you can isolate and say, okay, you know, I don't want this effect to affect the midtones, so we can take it out of the midtones and just have it affect the highlight and the shadow areas. And there's just a lot of things you can do. So those are the 5 tools that I often use when I'm color grading. I know there are a bunch of different ways to do things, so I'd really love to hear the tools and methods you use for your color grading. But for me, I like these 5 tools. I like to keep things simple. I've seen other videos where they give you kind of these 2, 3, 4-step processes to create a certain look. But I think that with these 5 tools, and in combination with sometimes blend modes and blend ranges, you can create a really wide variety of looks for your color grading. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and like I said, if you have, I would love to hear the ways you color grade, because I do actually learn a lot from some of your comments. Some of you post some really helpful comments that I can use for future videos, or just use for my work in general. So I would really love to hear your color grading methods in Affinity Photo. So until next time guys, thanks for watching. Peace.